A lonely widow shared her umbrella with a stranger, who turned out to be her long-lost son. The words had been echoing in Margaret Wilson's mind for 43 years, like a story she'd once read but never finished. Only it wasn't a story she'd read. It was a prayer she'd whispered into the universe every single day since that rainy April morning when her world had shattered. Rain pattered against the windows of Margaret's small apartment, the sound both soothing and haunting. At 68, she had grown accustomed to the symphony of emptiness, the ticking clock on the mantel, the occasional creak of settling floorboards, the hollow echo of her own footsteps across hardwood floors. The rain added a melancholy percussion to her solitude, a rhythm that matched the beating of her tired heart. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she traced the worn edges of the photograph she kept beside her bed. A toddler with bright eyes and a smile that could melt glaciers gazed back at her, frozen in time. 25 years had passed since Robert's death, her husband, her anchor, but 43 years had passed since she'd last seen her son. "Another day, Ethan," she whispered to the photograph. "Another day I've looked for your face in every crowd." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof with growing urgency. Margaret glanced at the clock. Nearly time for her weekly trip to the farmer's market. In the 5 years since retiring from teaching elementary school, she had crafted rituals to give structure to the shapeless expanse of her days. Wednesday mornings meant fresh produce, friendly exchanges with familiar vendors, and the comforting illusion of connection. She lowered the photograph and rose from her bed, bones aching with the damp chill that seemed to seep through the walls. The weather forecast had predicted only a light shower, but the darkening sky outside her window told a different story. Margaret retrieved her umbrella from the stand by the door, a large, sturdy thing with a wooden handle worn smooth by years of use. Robert had given it to her on their 10th anniversary, a practical gift from a practical man. "Not quite roses and chocolates," he had said with a sheepish smile, "but it'll keep you dry for years to come." He had been right about that, at least. The umbrella had outlasted him by decades. The walk to the market was only 6 blocks, but in the strengthening downpour, it felt much longer. Margaret clutched the collar of her coat tightly around her neck with one hand, the umbrella steady in the other. Water sloshed around her ankles, soaking through her sensible shoes. She considered turning back, abandoning her weekly ritual in favor of dry socks and a hot cup of tea. But routine was a powerful force, sometimes the only thing keeping her afloat in a sea of memories and regrets. The market was half empty, most of the usual shoppers deterred by the weather. Colorful canopies sagged under the weight of collected rainwater, and vendors huddled beneath them, faces etched with the resigned expression of people whose livelihoods depended on whims of nature. Margaret made her way to Mrs. Chen's produce stand, where she bought 2 apples, a small bunch of grapes, and a single potato, a widow's grocery list, measured for 1. "Weather's turning nasty, Miss Margaret," Mrs. Chen commented as she handed over the small paper bag. "You should get home before it gets worse." "I'll be fine," Margaret assured her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've weathered worse storms." She had indeed, storms that had nothing to do with rain or wind, but with loss so profound it had nearly drowned her. As Margaret turned to leave, a sudden gust tore through the market, flipping canopies inside out and sending loose items tumbling across the ground. Her umbrella strained against her grip, threatening to launch skyward and carry her with it, like Mary Poppins in reverse. She wrestled with it, arms aching with the effort, when suddenly the weight shifted. A strong hand had grabbed the handle alongside hers. "Let me help you with that," said a deep voice. Margaret looked up into the face of a stranger, a man perhaps in his mid-40s, with rain-soaked dark hair peppered with gray and eyes the color of wet slate. Something about those eyes sent an electric current down her spine, a flash of familiarity so intense it made her breath catch. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible above the storm. Together they steadied the umbrella. He was tall enough that Margaret had to raise it higher than was comfortable for her, but she didn't mind. There was something solid about his presence, a gravity that seemed to center the chaos of the wind and rain around them. "Heading home?" he asked. Margaret nodded. 6 blocks east. "I'm going that direction myself," he said, though something in his voice suggested this might not have been his original destination. "May I walk with you? This umbrella seems big enough for 2, and I'm already half drowned." He was more than half drowned. His jacket clung to his shoulders, water streaming from the cuffs. His jeans were dark with moisture, and his boots made a squelching sound with every step. Margaret felt a tug of sympathy, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. "Of course," she said. "I'm Margaret Wilson." "James," he replied, offering nothing more than the single name. "Thank you for sharing your shelter, Margaret." They walked in silence for a block, finding their rhythm together beneath the umbrella. The rain drummed steadily above them, creating a private world cocooned in the sound of water. Margaret was acutely aware of the stranger beside her, the smell of rain on wool, the careful distance he maintained, the way he adjusted his stride to match her shorter steps. "Are you new to the area?" she asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. It had been so long since she'd shared physical space with anyone for more than a passing moment. James hesitated before answering. "In a way, I lived here as a child, but it's been a very long time." "What brings you back?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'm looking for someone. A family member? A friend? A lost love?" Margaret wanted to ask, but didn't. Everyone had their stories, their private searches. She knew better than most how some quests were too tender to share with strangers. "I hope you find them," she said instead. James glanced down at her, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Thank you. I hope so too." They turned onto Maple Street, where Margaret had lived for the past 3 decades. The large oak trees that gave the street its misleading name formed a canopy overhead, their leaves creating a secondary percussion as rain filtered through them. "It's this one," Margaret said, nodding toward a modest 2-story house with blue shutters, its small front garden neat despite the battering rain. "Would you like to come in and dry off?" "I could make some tea." The invitation surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. Margaret Wilson did not invite strangers into her home. She had lived too long in careful solitude to break her boundaries so easily. Yet something about this rain-soaked man named James made her want to extend the moment, to prolong whatever inexplicable connection had formed beneath the shelter of Robert's umbrella. James looked at the house, then back at Margaret, conflict evident in the furrow of his brow. "I shouldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Margaret said, surprising herself again with her insistence. "Consider it a fair trade. You saved my umbrella, I'll save you from pneumonia." A small smile curved his lips, transforming his solemn face. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Inside, Margaret's home revealed the careful organization of someone who had grown accustomed to arranging things just so. Books lined shelves in alphabetical order. Framed photographs stood at precise intervals along the mantel. Everything had its place, a controlled environment that reflected the way she had learned to manage her grief, by containing it, compartmentalizing it, never allowing it to spill beyond its designated boundaries. "The bathroom is down the hall if you'd like to towel off," she said, gesturing. "I'll put the kettle on." While James disappeared into the bathroom, Margaret busied herself in the kitchen. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar ritual of tea-making, filling the kettle, selecting the cups. She chose the blue ones, hardly used since they were part of a set of 4, too many for a woman who lived alone, arranging cookies on a small plate. The domesticity of the act felt both foreign and achingly familiar, stirring memories of another life when her kitchen had been filled with laughter and the chaos of family. When James returned, his hair was damp but no longer dripping, his face padded dry. He'd removed his sodden jacket, leaving him in a gray Henley that still clung damply to his shoulders. Margaret gestured for him to sit at the small kitchen table by the window, where raindrops traced jagged paths down the glass. "You have a lovely home," he said, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "Thank you. I've been here a long time." She sat across from him, warming her hands on her own cup. "You said you lived here as a child? In this neighborhood?" James nodded, his eyes traveling around the kitchen as if searching for something. "Not this street specifically, but nearby. It looks different now. Some things are the same, though. The town has changed a lot in recent years," Margaret agreed. "They built that new shopping center where the drive-in theater used to be. And the elementary school was rebuilt after the fire in '97. You know the area well." "I taught at that elementary school for 35 years, she said. "Second grade? I just retired 5 years ago." A shadow passed over James's face. "You were a teacher?" "It was a way to be surrounded by children," Margaret said softly, then caught herself. She never spoke so candidly with strangers. Something about the rain, the unusual circumstance of company in her kitchen, had loosened the careful restrictions she placed on her words. "I mean, I love teaching." "Loved teaching." James's fingers tightened around his cup. "Were you always here? Or did you teach elsewhere before?" The question seemed oddly specific, almost probing. Margaret felt a flutter of unease, quickly dismissed. What could this stranger possibly want to know about her unremarkable career? Always here, she answered. Well, except for a brief period in the late 70s when I took some time off. Her voice caught slightly. Personal reasons. James nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. There was an intensity to his gaze that Margaret found both unsettling and compelling. He seemed to be drinking in her features, memorizing them. "Do you have family here?" he asked suddenly. The question hit her like a physical blow. Margaret set her teacup down with a small clatter. "No," she said. "No family. My husband passed away 25 years ago. We had no children." The lie slipped out automatically, practiced over decades. It was easier than the truth, than explaining about Ethan, about the search, about the hollow space in her chest that nothing had ever filled. But something in James's expression made her want to call the words back, to unsay the practiced falsehood. Before she could reconsider, however, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house, making them both jump. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. "Sounds like the storm is getting worse," James observed, his voice neutral, though something in his posture had changed, a new tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his mouth. "The power goes out sometimes in weather like this," Margaret said. "There are candles in the drawer if we need them." They lapsed into silence, the rain creating a background drone that filled the space between them. Margaret found herself studying James covertly, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way his brow furrowed slightly as he gazed out at the storm. There was something about him that tugged at her memory, like a word stuck on the tip of her tongue. "Do you have somewhere to be?" she asked. "I don't mean to keep you if you have appointments." James shook his head. "No appointments. As I said, I'm looking for someone, but the search has taken years. A few more hours won't make a difference." "Years? It must be someone very important to you." "The most important," he said simply. His gaze returned to her face with that same searching intensity. "Can I ask you something personal, Margaret?" She hesitated, then nodded. "You said you have no children, but there are toys on the shelf in your living room, and children's drawings framed on the wall." Margaret's heart stuttered. Most visitors never noticed those things. The small wooden train tucked between books on the shelf, the faded crayon drawings preserved behind glass. She kept them in plain sight, a quiet act of defiance against the universe that had taken her son, a refusal to erase his existence even as she simplified her story for casual acquaintances. She began, then stopped, uncertain how to explain. James waited, patient, his eyes never leaving hers. "The truth is," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I did have a child, a son." The words hung in the air between them, charged with decades of unspoken grief. "What happened?" James asked softly. Margaret looked down at her hands, twisted together on the table. How to compress such immensity into words? How to explain the earthquake that had torn her life in two, before and after? "He was taken," she said finally. "Not by death, though sometimes I thought that might have been easier, at least to understand. He was 3 years old. We were at a park in Minneapolis. We lived there briefly while my husband was finishing his degree." I looked away for just a moment. Her voice broke. "Just one moment." James's hand moved across the table, not quite touching hers, but close. "You don't have to tell me." But Margaret found she wanted to tell him. After decades of careful silence, of tucking her grief away where it wouldn't disturb others, the words were rising like floodwater, impossible to contain. "The police searched. There were posters, newspaper articles. Nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. My husband and I, we fell apart after that. Not right away. We tried for years to hold each other up. But grief like that, it changes you. We couldn't look at each other without seeing what we'd lost." "But you stayed together," James said. 25 years, you said." "We did. We moved here to start fresh. Though fresh starts are never really possible, are they?" Robert buried himself in his work. "I threw myself into teaching. We built a life around the absence. And when he died, cancer, it was quick at least, I kept going because I didn't know what else to do." Outside, the storm raged on, punctuating her story with distant thunder. The rain beat against the windows like thousands of tiny fists demanding entry. "What was his name?" James asked, his voice strangely tight. "Your son, Ethan," Margaret said, and the name felt both foreign and achingly familiar on her tongue. "His name was Ethan." James closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they glistened with what might have been tears, though it could have been a trick of the light. "I'm so sorry," he said. "It was a long time ago, but you never stopped looking for him." It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. Never. Even after the police closed the case, even after Robert gave up hope, I kept searching. I've hired private investigators over the years. I checked missing persons databases. I've submitted my DNA to all those ancestry sites, hoping somehow... She trailed off, suddenly embarrassed by the admission. How desperate she must sound to this stranger, this man who was kind enough to walk her home, but certainly hadn't bargained for the outpouring of a lifetime of grief. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I don't usually talk about this. I don't know why I'm telling you all of this." "Sometimes it's easier to tell things to a stranger," James said quietly. "No history, no expectations." Margaret nodded, grateful for his understanding. "What about you? This person you're looking for, are they family?" A complex emotion crossed James's face, too quickly for Margaret to interpret. "Yes," he said after a moment. "Family." The way he said the word, with such weight, such reverence, made Margaret's heart ache. Her family had been reduced to memories and photographs, to small preserved relics of a life that had slipped through her fingers like sand. "I hope you find them," she said again, meaning it more deeply this time. James looked directly into her eyes. "I think I already have." The words made no sense at first, sliding past Margaret's comprehension like water over stones. When their meaning finally penetrated, her breath caught in her throat. "What did you say?" "I was born James Peterson," he said, his voice steady but threaded with emotion. "But before that, for the first 3 years of my life, I was Ethan Wilson." The room seemed to tilt around Margaret. The rain, the thunder, everything receded except for the man sitting across from her, claiming to be her lost son. "Impossible. Absolutely impossible. That's not... You can't be..." she stammered, her hands gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. "I was taken from a park in Minneapolis in 1979, James continued, his words measured as if he'd rehearsed them countless times. "The man who took me, David Peterson, was mentally ill. He believed I was his son. His own child had died the year before, and in his delusion, he thought I was the same boy. He never hurt me, never. He raised me as his own, moved us constantly so we wouldn't be found." Margaret shook her head, unable to process what she was hearing. This couldn't be happening. Not after all these years. Not like this. Not in her kitchen on a rainy Wednesday with grocery bags still unpacked on the counter. "How can you possibly know you're my Ethan?" she whispered. James... No, she couldn't think of him as Ethan, not yet, reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph protected in a small plastic sleeve. He placed it gently on the table between them. "This is the only thing I have from before. David kept it. I found it among his things after he died 15 years ago." Margaret's hands trembled as she picked up the photograph. It showed a smiling woman with a toddler on her lap, herself, so much younger, with Ethan. She recognized the picture immediately. It had been taken at a studio for Ethan's 2nd birthday, and a copy had been included on the missing persons posters. "This doesn't prove..." she began, but her voice failed her. The resemblance between the solemn-faced man across from her and the laughing toddler in the photograph was subtle but unmistakable, something in the set of the eyes, the curve of the mouth. "I've spent the last 15 years piecing together who I was before," James said. "When David died, I found newspaper clippings about a missing boy. It took years of research to find your name, to track you here. And then more years to find the courage to come." 15 years, Margaret echoed. "You've known for 15 years and you're only coming now?" The hurt in her voice was evident, and James flinched as if she'd struck him. "I was afraid," he admitted, his composure cracking for the first time. "What David did was unforgivable, but he was the only father I knew. And I was afraid, terrified, that you wouldn't believe me, or worse, that you wouldn't want me after all this time." "Not want you?" Margaret's voice broke on the words. "I've looked for you every day for 43 years. I've seen your face in every crowd, searched for you in every city I've visited. Not want you? Oh, Ethan." The name slipped out unbidden, and with it the dam broke. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, tears she had carefully rationed for decades, allowing herself only the private moments of grief on birthdays and holidays. "I can prove it," James said urgently. "We can do a DNA test. I have documents, research." Margaret raised a hand to stop him. "Look at me," she said softly. "Really look at me." James fell silent, his eyes locked with hers. "You have your father's eyes," she whispered. "And that small scar on your chin. You fell on a toy truck when you were 2. You were always afraid of loud noises, thunderstorms especially. You had a stuffed elephant named Poe that you couldn't sleep without." James's breath caught. "I still have nightmares during thunderstorms," he said. I never knew why. The thunder outside seemed to underscore his words, a cosmic punctuation to the moment of recognition unfolding between them. "And you shared your umbrella with me today?" Margaret said, a tremulous smile breaking through her tears. "My Ethan always shared. Even his cookies, even his favorite toys." Ethan, reached across the table then, his hand covering hers. The touch was electric, a circuit completing after decades of disconnection. Margaret turned her hand over, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. "Mother," he said, testing the word, his voice thick with emotion. The single word unraveled the last of Margaret's composure. She rose from her chair, moved around the table, and opened her arms. After the briefest hesitation, Ethan stood and stepped into her embrace. He was so tall, so solid, a man, not the little boy who had been torn from her life. Yet as his arms encircled her, as she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heart beating strong and steady, Margaret felt the years collapse like a telescope folding in on itself. Here was her son, returned to her as if the universe had finally decided to right its terrible wrong. They stood like that for a long moment, the storm raging outside while inside, in the quiet kitchen, two broken pieces of a family tentatively began to fit themselves back together. "I have so many questions," Margaret said finally, reluctantly drawing back to look up at him. "So much I want to know about your life." "We have time," Ethan said, smiling through his own tears. "If you'll have me in your life, we have all the time in the world now." Margaret reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the contours of the man who had grown from her lost little boy. "Tell me everything," she said. "Start at the beginning." They moved to the living room, where the rain-washed light filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows across the floor. Margaret sat close to Ethan on the sofa, unable to bear even a small distance between them, afraid that if she let go, he might disappear again like a dream upon waking. Ethan told her of his childhood with David Peterson, strange and isolated, but not unhappy. David had been gentle in his madness, devoted in his delusion. They had moved often, always small towns, always quiet lives on the fringes. David had homeschooled him, worked odd jobs that required little interaction with others. Only as Ethan entered adolescence did he begin to question the peculiarities of their existence, the lack of photographs from his infancy, the absence of extended family, the way David would sometimes call him by another name in his sleep. "When I was 16, I found the newspaper clippings," Ethan said, "hidden in an old Bible. Articles about a missing boy from Minneapolis who matched my age. I confronted David, but he had a breakdown, became so distraught I thought he might harm himself. I convinced myself it was a coincidence." "You were just a child yourself," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "You couldn't have known. After he died, I found more. Your missing persons report, the photograph, notes he'd kept about avoiding certain areas. It was like discovering my entire life had been built on quicksand." Ethan's voice grew distant, his eyes focused on something Margaret couldn't see. "I was 30 by then, with a life of my own. I didn't know what to do with the truth." "What did you do?" Margaret asked gently. "I ran from it at first, tried to bury it, to convince myself it didn't matter who I had been before. I had a career, friends, a life that felt real to me even if it was built on a lie." He smiled sadly. "But the past has a way of demanding acknowledgement. I started researching piece by piece. It took years to find enough information to lead me here." "And your life now? Are you married? Do I have grandchildren?" The questions tumbled out, years of wondering compressed into urgent inquiries. A shadow crossed Ethan's face. "No marriage, no children. I've had relationships, but they never seemed to last. I think part of me was always searching, always aware of the missing pieces." He hesitated. "I'm an architect. I design homes for other people, places where families can build their lives. I like to think I'm good at it." "An architect," Margaret repeated, a fresh wave of tears threatening. "Your father, Robert, he would have been so proud. He was in construction, did you know that? He built houses." "I didn't know," Ethan said softly. "Tell me about him. Tell me everything I missed." So Margaret did. As the storm gradually subsided outside, she told Ethan about his father, the practical man who gave umbrellas as anniversary gifts, who built birdhouses in his spare time, who could fix anything but couldn't mend his own broken heart. She told him about the search for Ethan, about the years of hope slowly eroding into resigned grief. She showed him photographs of birthdays he never celebrated with them, of the room they had kept ready for years in case of his return. "We never gave up," she said. "Even when the police said we should prepare for the worst, we never stopped believing you were out there somewhere." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "Sorry you suffered so much because of what happened to me." "No," Margaret said firmly. "No apologies. None of this was your fault. And you're here now. That's all that matters." The rain had stopped, though droplets still pattered from the eaves, a gentle afterthought to the storm. The late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the windows. Margaret and Ethan sat in this new illumination, their faces still traced with tears, but their eyes alight with wonder. "I can't believe you're really here," Margaret said, looking at her son with unabashed adoration. "In all my searching, I never imagined finding you would be as simple as sharing an umbrella in the rain." Ethan laughed, the sound warming Margaret to her core. "There's nothing simple about it. Think of all the coincidences that had to align. Me finally finding this town, being at that market today, the storm happening just as you were there." "I don't believe in coincidences," Margaret said. "Not anymore. Call it fate, call it grace. Whatever brought you back to me, I'm grateful." They ordered takeout for dinner, neither willing to separate even long enough for Margaret to cook. As they ate, they continued sharing, filling in the vast empty spaces of their divided lives. Ethan showed her pictures on his phone, of his apartment in Chicago, of projects he had designed, of the dog he had rescued 3 years ago. Margaret brought out albums, school programs, keepsakes she had preserved through the decades. "I kept everything," she admitted. "Every drawing you made before you were taken, every toy you loved. I couldn't bear to part with anything that proved you had existed, that you had been mine." When night fell, Margaret prepared the guest room with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the knowledge that her son would sleep under her roof for the first time in 43 years. She put fresh sheets on the bed, placed towels in the adjoining bathroom, found herself straightening picture frames and fluffing pillows with nervous energy. "It's not much," she said apologetically when she showed him the room. "We can look for a hotel if you'd prefer." "This is perfect," Ethan interrupted gently. "More than perfect." They stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite knowing how to say goodnight after so many nights lost to absence. "I'm afraid to sleep," Margaret confessed suddenly. "Afraid I'll wake up and find this was all a dream." Ethan stepped forward and embraced her again, his strong arms a fortress around her small frame. "I'll be here in the morning," he promised. "And the morning after that, if you'll have me?" "Always," Margaret whispered fiercely. "Always." She slept fitfully that night, waking every hour to reassure herself that it had been real, that her son had truly returned to her. Each time she would tiptoe to the guest room door, listening for the sound of his breathing, allowing herself only the smallest peek inside to confirm his presence. In the pale light of dawn, Margaret found Ethan already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, studying the framed photographs on the wall with intent concentration. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and the smile that bloomed across his face was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "Good morning, Mother." The word still sent a shock through her system. Mother, a title she had held in her heart for 43 years, but had not heard spoken to her in all that time. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, moving to the coffee pot to pour herself a cup, needing the mundane activity to ground herself in this new reality. "Better than I have in years," Ethan replied. "There's something about being here. It feels like coming home, even though I don't remember ever being here before." "Because this is where you belong," Margaret said simply. They shared a breakfast of toast and fruit, making plans for the day ahead. There would be practical matters to address, DNA tests to confirm what they both already knew in their hearts, legal procedures to possibly restore Ethan's original identity, decisions about how and where they would build their relationship moving forward. "I can transfer to the firm's office in Hartford," Ethan said. "It's only a 40-minute drive from here. I could find a place nearby or—" He trailed off, uncertainty flickering across his features. "Or you could stay here," Margaret finished for him. "This house has always been too big for just me. The third bedroom could be converted to a home office. If you wanted, that is. If it wouldn't be too strange, living with a mother you're just getting to know." "Not strange," Ethan said. "Miraculous. After breakfast, the sun now fully risen in a sky washed clean by yesterday's storm, Margaret suggested a walk. "I'd like to show you the town if you're up for it. It's changed over the years, but the important places are still here." They walked side by side down Maple Street, Margaret occasionally slipping her hand into the crook of Ethan's arm, still needing the physical reassurance of his presence. She showed him the park where she had spent countless hours watching other people's children play, imagining Ethan among them. She showed him the elementary school where she had taught, telling him stories of her students over the years. "I kept teaching second grade," she explained. "Always second grade, because that was how old you were the last time I had you for a full school year. I think I was trying to freeze time, to stay connected to you somehow." As they walked, people greeted Margaret by name, the pharmacist watering flowers outside his shop, the librarian walking her dog, neighbors collecting their mail. Each time, Margaret performed introductions with barely contained joy. "This is my son Ethan," she said, the words a balm to decades of wounds. She didn't explain further, didn't attempt to compress their extraordinary reunion into casual conversation. There would be time for explanations later. For now, it was enough to walk in the sunshine with her son beside her, to feel the weight of his arm beneath her hand, to hear his voice asking questions about the town where his mother had built a life while waiting for him to return. In the early afternoon, they found themselves at the town cemetery, standing before Robert Wilson's grave. Margaret had brought flowers, daisies, nothing fancy, just as Robert would have preferred. "I wish you could have known him," she said as they stood together before the simple headstone. "He was a good man, a wonderful father. He never stopped loving you, even when hope began to fade." Ethan knelt, placing his hand on the sun-warmed stone. "I wish I could have known him too," he said quietly. "Thank you, Father, for taking care of her until I could find my way back." Margaret's heart swelled with love so intense it was almost painful. In that moment, watching her son honor the father he couldn't remember, she felt Robert's presence as strongly as if he stood beside her. "He knows," she said, certain of it to her core. "Wherever he is, he knows you've come home." They walked back to the house hand in hand, the future stretching before them like a road newly revealed after a storm, uncertain in its details but bright with promise. There would be challenges ahead, Margaret knew. 43 years could not be bridged in a day or a week or even a year. They were strangers in many ways, for all their shared blood and reclaimed connection. But as they reached the front porch, Margaret paused, looking up at the sun she had found again in the most unexpected of ways. "Do you know what today is?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "It's April 17th, she said. 43 years ago today you were taken from me. And today you've returned." Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes. "The universe has a strange sense of timing." "Or a perfect one," Margaret countered. As they stood on the threshold of her home, their home now, Margaret thought about the umbrella still drying in the stand by the door, the practical gift from a practical man that had, in its own way, brought her son back to her. She thought about the rain that had driven Ethan to seek shelter beneath it, about the countless small decisions and moments that had aligned to create this miracle. A lonely widow had shared her umbrella with a stranger, who turned out to be her long-lost son. The story she had carried in her heart for decades had finally found its ending, or perhaps more accurately, its new beginning. "Come inside," Margaret said, opening the door to the future they would build together. "You're home now." And with his mother's hand in his, Ethan James Wilson stepped across the threshold, ending one journey and beginning another, a journey not of searching, but of belonging.